Fracis lived 1182 to 1226 AD, and Dominic lived 1170 to 1221 AD. There is a sad fact about the institutions which men found. No matter how clearly the founders may state their goals, eventually high-purposed degenerate and organizations develop bureaucracies whose main goal seems to be to preserve their own existence and power. The church is affected by this tendency as well. Every so often during the Middle Ages, someone noticed that the church was in need of reform. Benedict had withdrawn from Rome and founded his monastery around 500 AD. 500 years later, Hildebrand, another monk, led a reform movement from within the church, eventually as Pope himself. 100 years later, two more reformers arose. Their movements led to the founding of two new and different kinds of monastic orders. In another 200 years, a German monk named Martin Luther would lead another reform movement, but that is a different story. The first reformer was named Fracis. He was the son of a wealthy merchant family in one of the new prosperous towns of northern Italy. He seems to have been well educated and to have indulged himself in all the usual passions of youth. But while he was still a young man, a change came over him. One night when he had been attending a costume party, he disappeared and his friends found him sitting on the curb of the street, dejected. "What's the matter, Fracis? Did you get married?" they asked. "Yes," he replied, "to the fairest of all brides, Lady Poverty." Fracis had become convinced that the source of all troubles came from quarrels over poverty. He renounced his family fortune, but instead of withdrawing to a monastery to devote himself to prayer and study, he resolved to stay in the world and seek to help and serve all those he could. He, and the followers who soon joined him, had no possessions and lived by begging. Fracis would not let any of his followers accept more food or money than they needed for one day. And everywhere they went, they sought out the sick and the poor and did what they could to help them, all the while urging people to repent from their sins. Francis's followers, who came to be called Franciscans, were different from earlier monks in at least two ways. First, they were much more strict about the vow of poverty. Many of the older monasteries owned large amounts of land and were quite prosperous. Of course, none of the Benedictine monks owned the land personally, but as a group they benefited. Fracis insisted that his followers should never own anything, even as a group. The second difference was that, unlike the earlier monks, Fracis did not believe his followers should withdraw from the world and remain in one place. Instead, he told them they should travel from place to place, never staying anywhere too long, lest they be tempted to acquire possessions and settle down. It was in traveling from town to town that the Franciscans encountered their first opposition. In several towns, the local bishops did not look kindly on these new itinerant monks who begged for their food. In some towns, the bishops issued orders forbidding the Franciscans from preaching or begging. They were evicted from some towns and imprisoned in others. Finally, Fracis himself made a journey to Rome to seek an audience with the Pope. Fracis sincerely wanted confirmation from the Pope as to whether his new order and its way of life conformed to God's will. To the surprise of many, the Pope gave Fracis his blessing and formally recognized his followers. He gave orders that the Franciscans were to be allowed by all the bishops of the church to beg, preach, and work in service to the poor. Notice was sent to the bishops that the Franciscans were under the special protection of the Pope. Saint Francis. After Fracis died, the rules of his order gradually changed. The vows of poverty became less strict, and groups of monks began to acquire buildings and land. Many of the Franciscans opposed the acquisition of property. They felt it went against what Fracis had taught, but in the end, the less strict brothers won. Years later, when one of the strict followers of Fracis saw the great basilica which had been built over the tomb of St. Francis at Assisi, he is reported to have remarked, "Now the only thing you lack is women." And it was not long before, in common report, the friars had these too. And so the Franciscans went the same way as the earlier monastic orders. The second reformer was a Spaniard from a noble family named Dominic. He had become a priest and was serving as secretary to a bishop. While traveling with his bishop through southern France, he was disturbed by several things. First, the clergy of the church were not living as they should. They were not respected by the people. Second, he learned that many Christians had no knowledge of the stories of the Bible or what they meant. Dominic decided that what was needed was a group of traveling teachers. Dominic began the movement himself and soon was joined by a number of companions. They went from town to town preaching and teaching the lay people and called on the clergy to reform their lives. From the very beginning, the Dominicans, as the followers of Dominic came to be called, were devoted to education, and today around the world there are many schools which have been founded and are run by Dominicans. One of the most important things Dominic did was use his skills as the administrator to devise a system of government for the Dominican order. Each region was divided into provinces, and in each region the order was governed by representatives elected by each of the Dominican houses. It is very likely that the English Parliament, which began under the auspices first of Simon de Montfort, Saint Dominic's godchild, and then of Edward I, whose confessor and friends were Dominicans, owned some of its features to this Dominican influence. Because of their efficient organization and dedication to education, Saint Dominic was often called the Hammer of Heretics, and his friars the Hounds of God, who drove lost sheep back into the fold. Unfortunately for the reputation of St. Dominic and his order, in latter years the popes chose the Dominicans to direct and staff a new institution, the Inquisition, whose purpose was to bring heretics back into the church by more stringent means than preaching and teaching. When heretics failed to recant to their satisfaction, they often took drastic measures to prevent heresy from contaminating others. The methods of Inquisition represent some of the worst things ever done in the name of Christianity, but its excesses cannot be charged to St. Dominic. St. Dominic.